Hospitals are built to save lives, but anyone who has spent enough time inside one knows they can also become places where grief lingers far longer than it should. Every hallway carries stories that visitors will never hear, and every old building has areas quietly forgotten over time. Maintenance corridors are sealed behind locked doors, abandoned wings disappear from updated floor plans, and some elevators seem to remember destinations that no longer officially exist. The story you're about to hear was inspired by a personal experience shared by a member of the DarkTape community. While certain details have been expanded for storytelling, the encounter at its center came directly from someone who lived through it. I was around 10 years old when it happened. My older sister, Tiami, was nearly 18, and our cousin, T, had come with us to visit a family member who had been admitted to a large hospital. We had been there for hours, and by early evening the adults suggested we go downstairs to grab something from the food vendors while they stayed behind. It seemed simple enough. My sister took my hand, my cousin walked beside us, and together we made our way through the nearly empty hallways. Even as a child, I had a habit of sensing when something wasn't right. I could never explain it to anyone, especially because I rarely spoke due to selective mutism. Instead of putting those feelings into words, I carried them silently, hoping they would disappear on their own. As we walked toward the elevators, that familiar feeling returned. It wasn't fear exactly. It felt more like the strange certainty that something was waiting just beyond the next corner. The hospital itself seemed unusually quiet. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead while the polished floors reflected every step we took. Nurses hurried past without looking up, patient room doors remained closed, and the farther we walked, the more the silence seemed to swallow every sound around us. My sister noticed me tightening my grip on her hand and smiled, asking if I was okay. I nodded without speaking. She squeezed my hand gently and told me we'd be eating in just a few minutes. When we reached the elevator, the doors opened almost immediately. The three of us stepped inside, and my sister pressed the button that should have taken us toward the lower public level where the vendors were located. The doors closed, and for a moment, everything felt normal. Then the elevator began moving. The display above the doors changed to B1. None of us reacted. Hospitals often have basements. A few seconds later, it changed again, B2. My cousin frowned. I didn't know this place had two basements. Neither did my sister. Before either of them could question it further, the elevator continued descending. The lights overhead flickered once before stabilizing, and the temperature inside the small metal box dropped enough for me to notice goosebumps forming on my arms. My sister pressed the button for the floor we'd originally selected, but nothing happened. She pressed it again. Still nothing. Then the display changed one final time. Instead of another number, a single red letter appeared. M. The elevator slowed to a stop. None of us moved. The doors slid open with a long metallic groan, revealing a hallway that didn't look like it belonged beneath the same hospital. The walls were older, stained with water damage, and the fluorescent fixtures hanging from the ceiling buzzed so loudly they almost drowned out every other sound. Several lights had burned out completely, leaving long stretches of darkness between the pools of pale white light. Metal carts lined one side of the corridor, some draped with aging white sheets that hung almost to the floor. The air that drifted into the elevator was cold enough to make me shiver. It carried the familiar smell of disinfectant, but beneath it was another scent I couldn't identify. Something stale that reminded me of flowers left sitting too long in standing water. "We need to go," my cousin whispered. My sister immediately began pressing the closed door button over and over again. Nothing happened. The doors remained open, as though the elevator itself was waiting. Then we heard it. Footsteps. Slow, measured, not hurried, not dragging, just a steady rhythm echoing through the hallway. Each step sounded closer than the last. A figure slowly emerged from the darkness beneath the flickering lights. At first, I noticed only the dress. It wasn't white. It wasn't stained with blood. The gown itself was a deep crimson red, made in a style that looked decades out of place, with long lace sleeves trailing softly as she walked. A matching veil covered most of her face, but as she entered the light, two pale eyes became visible beneath the lace. Then I saw her smile. It wasn't welcoming. It wasn't threatening. It was simply wrong. She stopped just outside the elevator, lifted her head ever so slightly, and looked directly at us. Then, without making a single sound, she took one slow step forward.
For what felt like an eternity, none of us moved. The woman stood just outside the elevator, her crimson gown hanging motionless despite the cold air drifting through the corridor. The veil concealed most of her face, yet I couldn't look away from the smile beneath it. It never widened, it never faded, it simply remained there, as though it had been frozen in place for years. My sister's grip on my hand became almost painful. She continued pressing the close door button over and over, each frantic press accompanied by the same lifeless silence from the elevator. It was as if the controls had stopped working the moment we reached that floor. The woman took another step. Her footsteps echoed through the hallway, but something about them didn't make sense. The sound always seemed just a fraction of a second behind her movement, as though the hallway itself was struggling to keep up with wherever she had come from. Another step, then another. Each time the overhead lights flickered, she appeared closer than she should have been. There was no rush in her movements. She wasn't chasing us. She walked with the calm certainty of someone who already knew she would eventually reach us. I finally looked up at my sister. She wasn't staring at the woman anymore. She was staring at the floor indicator above the elevator doors. It still displayed the single red letter, M. Without warning, every light inside the elevator went out. The darkness lasted only a second. When the lights returned, the woman was standing only a few feet away. I could finally see beneath the veil. Her skin was impossibly pale, almost gray, beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. Her eyes looked cloudy, as though they had long since lost the ability to blink. The smile stretching across her face wasn't one of happiness or anger. It looked practiced, as though she'd forgotten what a real smile was supposed to be. Then she slowly lifted one hand. Not to wave, not to reach for us. She simply pointed, directly at me. Before any of us could react, the elevator doors slammed shut with enough force to make all three of us jump. At that exact moment, the elevator shot upwards so violently, we nearly lost our balance. None of us spoke during the ascent. We simply stood there, listening to the cables groan above us, while the floor numbers climbed one after another until the familiar hospital levels finally returned. When the doors opened, everything appeared normal. Doctors walked through the hallway. Visitors pushed loved ones in wheelchairs. A volunteer smiled and asked if we needed help finding the cafeteria. For a moment, I almost convinced myself that none of it had happened. My sister never did. That night, she barely slept. When she finally did drift off, she woke screaming. She told us she'd dreamed about the same woman standing silently at the foot of her bed, still wearing the crimson wedding gown. She never moved. She never spoke. She only smiled.
The dreams continued for weeks, then months. Church didn't stop them. Prayers didn't stop them. Ignoring them didn't stop them. Eventually, my sister refused to talk about the woman altogether. Years passed, and life slowly moved forward. My cousin rarely mentioned that day again, and I buried the memory beneath everything else that came with growing up. I almost convinced myself it had been nothing more than an overactive imagination fueled by childhood fear. Then, nearly 20 years later, I returned to that same hospital. The building had been renovated. New paint covered the walls, updated signs hung from every ceiling, and the elevators had all been replaced with modern ones. Curiosity got the better of me, so I asked an older maintenance employee if the hospital had ever had a lower morgue beneath the main basement. He stared at me for several seconds before quietly shaking his head. "Not anymore," he replied. Before I could ask what he meant, he leaned a little closer. "There used to be an old service level below the morgue decades ago. Most of it was sealed after a fire. The elevators were reprogrammed, and eventually, everyone stopped talking about it." I felt a chill run through me. As I turned to leave, the old man spoke one last time. "If an elevator ever opens by itself, don't look outside." I laughed nervously, assuming he was trying to scare me. Then the elevator beside us chimed. Its doors slowly slid open. There was no one inside. The display above the doors wasn't showing a floor number. It displayed a single red letter. M. The security camera recording from that hallway ended 3 seconds later. Hospital administrators later claimed the camera had suffered an unexplained system failure. No maintenance logs recorded an elevator stopping on a floor designated M, and no employee could explain why the display briefly changed before returning to normal. The footage has never been released, but according to the technician who reviewed the final frame before the recording was corrupted, someone was standing inside the empty elevator. She was wearing a crimson wedding dress, and she was smiling.
You've reached the end of the tape, or maybe the tape reached the end of you. If you enjoyed this story, leave a like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you don't miss the next file. If you've lived through a nightmare you still can't explain, share it in the comments or send it to DarkTape. It could become our next story. Until the next transmission, sleep carefully.